Welcome to another episode of Kaleidoscope. Today my guest is Rabbi Rachel Gurevitz. She is well known around the community as the rabbi at B'nai Shalom Synagogue. But today we're going to see a different side, and I'm excited to learn more about one of her passions. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, so tell us first a little bit about your background. I know that you grew up and you immigrated here, but tell us a little bit about your life and how you got your education, how you became a rabbi, and what brought you to the United States.
Yeah, certainly. So I grew up in London. Actually, my family, when I was young, we were part of a modern Orthodox congregation. That's kind of the dominant group in the UK. And it wasn't until I went to college and had my first experience of Reform Judaism, a more liberal branch of Judaism, that I really started to rediscover the tradition I'd been born into, but in a way that really spoke to me for a couple of reasons. One, just the way we understand the evolution of our tradition, the nature of our texts, what they have to teach us. It's just a very different approach, and it was one that really aligned with things that I'd been thinking about for many years anyway. And also it's an egalitarian movement, and that had been something that I'd found very off-putting in my childhood, was being treated differently because of my gender. So that was the sort of beginning of a journey of sort of learning as a young adult, and there are lots of steps along the way, but eventually it leads me to decide that I wanted to serve my community and train as a rabbi. I started that in London at Leo Beck College, but I had been coming back and forth to the United States for several years because the reform movement in this country was just so many years ahead. There was a lot of energy and creativity, wonderful music, and music was one of the things that really spoke to me, and other things that I was working on. And I thought I'd come here and get inspired and then go back. But in that back and forth, I met someone who is now my wife, and we've been together for almost 25 years. So I transferred my training and finished my rabbinic school training at Hebrew Union College in New York City.
But while you were in London, you were studying, you got a doctorate in a subject that will connect to what we're going to be finding out about you.
Right, that's true, yes. So before I had gone into rabbinic school, my first degree was in geography. And I ended up specializing in an area of geography that was more like sociology, cultural studies, those kinds of departments in the United States. And I loved what I was doing, thought I would stay in academia, loved to teach. And so I did a PhD at University College London. And it was while I was doing that, I got a little turned off of academia. I was in a top department, but that meant there was a lot of competitiveness, a lot of pressure to research and publish, and I really love to teach more than some of those other areas, but I do love looking at the lens of life and understanding things through that lens of sociology. And you're right, that's been helpful in my rabbinic work, because rabbinic work is not just about teaching of texts and religious ideas, it's about how you build community. And all of that is sociology. You have to understand who the people are in the particular community you're in, and how to meet those needs and weave these different strands of who they are and what you're trying to bring them in terms of spirituality and community, and their faith tradition, how you bring those things together. But yes, it's also part of what we're here to talk about today, which is some of the backstory behind one of my favorite things to zip on at the end of a very long, hard day.
Now, you didn't just come here and say, well, where can I get a drink? So there must have been, I'm sure you did enjoy a cocktail or such, but your passion for it came from a variety of sources. And it's odd or unique, depending on your point of view, that you should have found a kindred spirit, pun intended, here in Westborough.
Right. Yeah. So, my in the UK, a lot of synagogues, having a small drink at the end of a service is part of what we call the kiddush, or if it's in the evening, sometimes it's called an oneg, but it's a gathering with food, usually some savory, some sweet. And if you come to our congregation here in Westborough, you'll have a choice of grape juice or Manischewitz, a sweet wine. But in the UK, it's quite common that one of the other choices is whiskey. And my father came from Scotland, so all of our family gatherings, nobody was a big drinker. My grandmother maybe had something once a week, but what she was going to have was a wee dram, is what we say in Glaswegian, a wee dram of whiskey, and any family occasion, that's what we had. So I kind of grew up with it, but not with any particular knowledge other than I enjoyed it. Not everyone can, it's a strong drink, not everyone enjoys it, but that's what I grew up in. One of my uncles worked for one of the companies, more on the marketing and business side for a few years. And then I come to the States, and my second job here out of the seminary and lands me in Westborough. And when I got here, my dad, who was busy online Googling, learned two things about Westborough before I did. He learned about Ullman's ice cream, which ends up being at the bottom of the street where I live, and he also learns about the Lock and Key Society, which is the name for the group of people who gather to learn and taste whiskey here at Julio's Liquors. And Ryan Maloney, who runs that store, has won every award imaginable, top international accolades for his knowledge of whiskey and his contribution to the whiskey world, not just in terms of what he knows and the seminars he provides for the community and the education he provides us, but also he's really got an expertise when it comes to choosing barrels or getting involved in special, unique blending projects. So I've been here now, this is my 13th year, and I don't get there all the time. I've missed more seminars than I've attended because I have a lot of evening meetings as a rabbi. But I get there, once every 6 to 8 weeks for a midweek seminar, and then he runs several festivals. So I have had this opportunity right here on my doorstep to learn so much about something that I'd enjoyed, for many, many years. But I think definitely has become a much more intense passion since I got to Westborough.
That's very serendipitous, actually. For me, it would have been Ullman's. That would have been the place. If I ever lived at the corner of near Ullman's, my life would be very different. I would be there every day. You also talked to me earlier about when you were here beginning your career and your family was here, that your congregation, you were getting accustomed to the traditions here. Did you introduce this tradition of the after-service drink at your synagogue?
I have not, no. We've had occasional, what I've done is, over the years, I've sometimes done special programs. I think that perhaps more so than in the UK, where the culture is a little different. I'm certainly conscious of the fact that it's not comfortable for everyone to be around alcohol. I don't want it to be present all the time. We have a very young congregation, and so the idea of having, certainly unsupervised, alcohol would not be appropriate. So no, it's not a regular part of what we put out, but I've done special seminars. We did programs where I did education around, for example, women who are master blenders or master distillers. And that's been a special program where you've opted in and you've signed up, and I've done that for actually for a conference of women cantors and cantorial soloists, and I've done it for our own congregation. I've done tasting panels, bringing whiskey from a particular part of the world, especially in our congregation. There's a whole new burgeoning whiskey world in Israel. I brought one sample of something unique from Israel here. So that's how I've been using it more. What I'm interested in actually is partly providing tastings for people, and that's something I hope to do more of perhaps a little later in life. But right now, what I've really gotten into, with that sociology background is I started doing some reading and some research and started to come across a lot of Jewish names involved in the history of particularly bourbon, not so much Scotch, but bourbon. And so my interest in bringing this to my congregation and beyond now is really that there is a lot of history that one can learn, not just about the Jewish community, but about immigration, about prohibition, about race and racism that affects really the whole country through the lens of bourbon.
Right, and you took a sabbatical. Now, you and I were in the higher ed world, and when I had to take a sabbatical, the job was that you produce something like a book or research. You took a very interesting sabbatical. Could you just tell us a little bit about that before we get into the sociological side?
Well, so my first sabbatical was not exactly what I'd expected. It was meant to take place in December of 2020.
Oh.
And there really wasn't anywhere to go then, if you remember. So, and also my congregation, I mean, we were all, everyone, we've had this conversation in your podcast series about how we all managed through the pandemic. I mean, our communities needed us to be here to help navigate through, a year where everything was new. So I took my sabbatical in the December of 21 into March of the following year. And that was the Omicron surge. So I still couldn't go a whole lot of places. But I wanted to take some time. First of all, my congregation didn't require me to come back with something specific. They knew that I just needed to recharge after that very intense year and a half of dealing with the pandemic. But for my own interest, I was reading books. I did an online certificate in Scotch whiskey, and I started to do some of this research to learn about the back history of bourbon. And got a certain way, launched a podcast myself called A Dram and a Drush, which is a little behind. I've not put much out most of this year. But I got a sort of a season and a half out, and I've got several banked episodes still to come. And the focus of that podcast was either Jews who happen to work in the whiskey business or Jewish professionals who happen to like whiskey. So they vary in terms of whether the theme is about sort of Jewish life and culture or whether it's more about the whiskey itself. But it's a bit of both. So I spent the sabbatical learning how to make a podcast, how to record it, what things I was going to need and use, a landing website for everything. So that was sabbatical number one. I go in a couple of weeks on the second half of that sabbatical, and I'll be doing some research in some archives in Louisville, specifically looking at things to do with Jews involved in the history of the bourbon industry. And I hope to do an online course this time around in bourbon, get a bourbon steward, which is just a kind of basic level. I know enough that I sound like I maybe am saying something vaguely correct when I'm talking about the various kinds of bourbons and the kinds of whiskeys that I want to teach about.
So now let's pick it up where you're talking about using your sociology background. And this is what I found fascinating because your research led you to a deeper understanding of the origins of the actual drink and how it was made and its connection to Judaism. So if you want to give us a little history about the makers and the breakers of bourbon.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that the earliest people involved in bourbon were not specifically Jews. I mean, it's farmers. Yeah. Farmers who, people who came to this country early on, and they take their excess crop that they're growing. So if it was upstate New York or if it was in Pennsylvania, that was rye. If it's, once you get down into Kentucky, corn grows incredibly well. So that's how we end up with different styles of American whiskey from different parts of the country. And, what they need to do in order to get by is take their excess produce, and whiskey is something that, doesn't rot, it doesn't go off, and you can use it to barter. And it's very much a part of American history. There's, as the country was owed a lot of money after the War of Independence, and George Washington decided to try and raise some of that money by imposing a whiskey tax, which there was a big rebellion, the
Yeah.
whiskey rebellion, people who couldn't afford to pay that tax because they didn't have like money. This was barter. This was how they kind of got by. And some of the early who became president, the back and forth, is shaped by the introducing and then the repealing and later again reintroducing whiskey taxes. Jews get involved when they start coming over as immigrants, and Jews were in this country early on, mainly from Sephardic backgrounds, Spanish and Portuguese backgrounds. But really, the big wave of Jewish immigration is in the late 1800s, and then they're coming from Europe, from Poland and Russia and Germany. And so that's when really we start seeing Jews involved in the industry in this country. Some of them start off in stores or in wholesalers, but the first to really have his own distillery is Isaac Wolf Bernheim. And he comes over in the late 1800s, and he and his brother, he starts off helping in a store, in a wholesaler, but then ends up buying his own distillery and comes out with what was one of the best-selling American bourbon whiskeys, I.W. Harper, and I have the bottle here of something that's the descendant of his whiskey. It's not exactly his anymore because companies and names get bought up by other companies. But I.W. Harper, he didn't call it I.W. Bernheim because bourbon was associated with the frontier and being an American. And he was a short, fat German guy and didn't think that the Bernheim name would be the name that would sell bourbon. So Harper sounded like a good American name. But yes, his whiskey, his basic I.W. Harper was one of the best-selling whiskeys through till the mid-60s, really. Yeah, and it's still around. It's still around, but that's one of the names. And because of his success, he was in love with the immigrant dream of making it in America. This was his. We say they would talk about the Golden Medina, the Golden Country. This is where you could come and escape all the hardships of Europe and make it. And he really did. And with the money that he made, he was very philanthropic. There are a couple of statues in the Capitol in Washington that represent Kentucky that he funded. He funded a number of special civic projects in Kentucky. There's the Bernheim Forest, this arboretum, which was land that he had bought that was turned over as this preservation in his name. And he also helped to fund the library at the original headquarters of the seminary where I was trained in Cincinnati, Hebrew Union College. So it really is a sort of an amazing, comes over with nothing and works his way up. And becomes a major mover and shaker in the bourbon industry.
Now, you also spoke with me about the integration of alcohol, whiskey, with civil rights and how the conflict between different groups and how bourbon and whiskey played a role in bringing people together and also dividing them. So that, again, goes back to your sociology. So we never really leave behind what we learn about.
Right.
It's really fascinating how it becomes the lens changes it. I mean, I could talk for hours about books and ice cream, but I don't think it'd be that interesting. So tell us a little bit more about that, because I think that is just a fascinating way. Now, did you find that in your research or from seminars?
So there's a wonderful book written by a scholar called Marnie Davis called Jews and Booze. And that was the first place. It wasn't just about whiskey, but it was the first place where I was reading about some of these histories and hearing about some of these characters. And she doesn't go into a lot of depth. So this is actually a theme that I hope when I go to Kentucky in January and do some archival research, I'm looking for hints to see whether I can find any more about this, because I'm interested. But one of the things that I picked up, and I don't know how widespread it was that, there were a lot of different groups that got involved in the push towards prohibition. The the primary group we think of are, were women's organizations, women who wanted to, take control of, how the household income was being spent, and it wasn't conducive to life at home or managing a household if, your husband was spending all of his money, down at the saloon. So that was what people associate with the main push. But there were lots of other groups that got on board, and they all had their own agendas. And so, for example, Henry Ford was very much in favor of prohibition. That may have had something to do with productivity in his factories, but he was also a really ugly anti-Semite. In his Dearborn newspaper, there are screeds against Jews for all kinds of things, including things to do with alcohol. Now, Jews were not particularly identified as a problematic group in terms of drunkenness. I mean, we're no more or less drunk than anybody else. We're just the same. But one of the things that he used to accuse Jews with regard to alcohol was that Jews were amongst the few they weren't really, Jews at that time were not really seen as white the way that many of us are today. And of course, not Jews are actually white, but we forget that there was this period where Jews were very much other, particularly in the early years of coming over from Eastern Europe. But we could pass because of our fair skins, particularly the ones from Eastern Europe. And Jews from Eastern Europe didn't mind setting up shop and running businesses in places where they could make money and run a business. They didn't come with the same history of how they interacted with African Americans. That's not to say that Jews weren't racist as well, because again, we are everything, so we're a complex group. But you would find Jewish store owners who were willing to serve in a bar or run a store in an African American neighborhood at a time when a lot of white people would not do that, because they wouldn't say to an African American, "How can I help you, sir?" Right? But that wasn't a problem. So you have those who are seeing Jews as facilitating something that is, there's a lot of racism there around, the problematics of African American drunks, for example, and that's very dangerous for the African American population. On the other hand, you've also got the African American population. If one of the only kinds of white owners that they're dealing with in their neighborhoods are Jews, Jews are seen by some African Americans as like, just out to make money, right? So that also reinforces stereotypes. So when you look at the sort of the layers of race and racism and what's going on, there's not sort of one simple story of like, here's the good guys and here's the bad guys, but it is, from a sociological point of view, very interesting to see how all of these stereotypes and tropes that unfortunately we are hearing way too often again today are all present in how people are talking about alcohol, bourbon, whiskey, and the push towards prohibition.
So let's get to these lovely bottles.
Yeah, so I brought just a few examples, really choosing particularly names and styles. So I mentioned already, this is this only came out a few years ago. This is a sort of a reviving of the I.W. Harper name. I.W. Harper, this name, as I said, originally Bernheim's whiskey, at this point is owned by a large conglomerate called Diageo. But this is a really pretty bottle. You can see it's sort of got a little bit of that sort of Art Deco-ish kind of look to it, and that's and this one is finished in a Cabernet cask. So this is a it says on it, it is a Kentucky straight bourbon. So there are now laws and rules around what can and can't be in these bottles, rules about what can be called a bourbon. A lot of people think it has to come from Kentucky. It doesn't, but it does have to come from the United States. And a straight bourbon means that it has been aged for at least 2 years in new charred oak barrels. It also tells you something about, there's some rules about the maximum proof that it can go into the barrel That's how much alcohol when it comes off the still, when it goes into the barrel. And that can't be more than 80% alcohol, which is like, that's stuff you can clean your hands with. But that's 160 proof. And it can't be bottled at less than 40%. So most whiskey has water added to it. Most whiskey, this one says 45% alcohol, 90 proof. A lot of bourbons are round about the sort of 43 to 46 mark, unless they are cask strength, in which case they could be in the high 50s or even into the 60s. So that's this one. And then I wanted just to bring a couple of other things here that just have a little bit of Jewish story to them. So this I actually just found in New York City this weekend. A lot of people have heard of Buffalo Trace. Buffalo Trace is a big distillery in Kentucky. A lot of different whiskeys come out of them. A lot of them are hard to find. People hunt for them. The Weller Buffalo Trace is now making Pappy, which is something that is very hard to get and sought after and ridiculous prices. But this is a bourbon. It says wheat recipe. So one of the things that they specialize in are a lot of bourbons. I should say the one thing I didn't tell you about bourbon is that to be called a bourbon, it has to be at least 51% corn in the mash bill. Oftentimes the ingredients after that is some amount of rye and then a little bit of malted barley just to help with the process of the fermentation. When the rye as the second ingredient is replaced with wheat, it's called a wheated bourbon. So that's what this is. And this one actually says kosher. Now, the thing about whiskey is that almost everyone, including in the Orthodox world, regards most whiskey as just kosher without needing to have a special stamp. But this company puts out a limited amount of this, says kosher on it, because not only does it conform with all of the laws of kashrut, but it's a separate group of barrels that just for the period of the festival of Passover get temporarily sold to somebody outside of their company, so that they are not in ownership of the grain-based spirit during a festival when we're not allowed to have anything grain-based that other than matzah. So this has kind of got its own story to it, and there's a rabbi who'll go and check on it and make sure they're following all the rules. I've not tried it yet. As I said, I just picked it up in New York City this weekend. I was really kind of excited to actually see a bottle because I've never seen one before. And then this bottle is interesting. I told you that Bernheim did not put his name on whiskey because they didn't think it would sell. But just a few years ago, the Bernheim distillery was bought by a company called Heaven Hill. Heaven Hill starts after Prohibition, early on, and some investors end up becoming the owners of the company. It's called, the family is called the Shapira family. It was 5 brothers. They are now, Heaven Hill is the largest independently owned bourbon company in the country, so still a Jewish-owned company. And as a kind of a nod to the heritage and the history, they created a wheat whiskey. That's where the first ingredient in the mash bill is wheat, at least 51% wheat. This was the first, I think, wheat whiskey to come out on the market, and they named it for Bernheim as a kind of a little piece of legacy there. So that's what I brought here. And then this was just something a little bit different at the end here, because whiskey is now made all over the world. People think of Scotch whiskey, they think of Irish whiskey, they think of bourbon, but every part of the world now, there are amazing award-winning whiskies. In England, English whiskies are now competing with Scottish whiskies. There's Welsh whiskey, there's Swedish whiskey, there's amazing whiskey out of Taiwan, there's Japanese whiskey. I mean, it's just, you can find whiskey being made in a lot of places, and more recently is Israeli whiskey. And so M&H comes out of Tel Aviv. They're making in the style of Scotch whiskey, so they're using single malt whiskey, which means it's 100% malted barley. So it's a different grain base than any of these. But because it's Israel, because of the climate, the whiskey ages much more quickly. So a 3-year-old Israeli whiskey can taste like a 10-year-old Scotch. It's similar to India. India also has whiskey that it tastes really good after 3 or 4 years. And this one is really unique because it was finished in a pomegranate wine cask. So it was in an oak barrel, probably an ex-bourbon to start with, and then they had a pomegranate wine that's made somewhere else in Israel. The wine gets sold, put into bottles, and then they take the empty barrel and put this in for it to age a little bit, and some of the flavor profiles and tones of that pomegranate wine make its way into the whiskey. And you'll find a lot of whiskeys get finished in something to add some depth of flavor and change the flavor profile. But I think this is the only one in the world that's finished in a pomegranate wine cask. So those are just some examples of the range of whiskeys that are out there that have some Jewish connections.
Well, I've learned so much from you because I thought whiskey was one thing, and it was this color of tea, and that bourbon was white, clear, liquid. And I had no idea. I've never tasted it. I have never, being Italian, this wasn't what my family, you could have a little bit of wine, but that was it. So this has just been so fascinating. So are we going to have a little taste testing?
I was going to do a little taste just as a kind of, this is one.
The homage one.
Yeah, the Bernheim wheat. And I know we've got some crew. After we've closed, I've got some glasses so we can share this around.
Yeah,
and
just see what it smells like.
Yeah, for sure. By the way, you talked about when whiskey is first made, when it comes off the still, it is clear. It is completely clear. What gives it its color is the wood, the barrels. There is the barrels are charred because that's a way. First of all, it filters out some of like the nasty stuff. It's like charcoal. It's a good filtering agent, but it's also drawing. This is why climate's important. The heat and the cold, because it draws the whiskey in and out of the wood, and those woods have sugars and they have compounds.
Yes.
And it's chemistry. But the color is imparted by the wood. Bourbon cannot have any artificial color. Scotch whiskey is allowed to put caramel coloring in. It doesn't taste of anything, but they're allowed to put it in. You'll find that more in blended whiskeys to create a more consistent color. But here in America, bourbon has to be natural color. So it's just the wood that's giving it its color.
Oh, it smells entirely different than I thought.
Yeah, you'd expect to get, a lot of, some people will get a lot of like fumes. And if, this one, which is bottled at cask strength, you'll get more alcohol fume because this is up at 64%. But this is, right, you get, it's immediately, it's like, there's a sweetness.
Sweetness.
A little bit of kind of cotton candy. We'll pour a little bit. There's an art to tasting. You always start with the smell, you want to sort of see what you're picking up because your nose is part of what you're tasting as well. And then when you taste, what I've been taught is take a tiny sip first because it's a strong alcohol, it will shock the taste buds. So you don't really get to taste what it tastes like in the first sip. So it's the tiniest amount, and then I'll take a little bit more and let it linger and see what am I tasting on the palate and also what am I tasting and experiencing as I swallow. And I know somebody who I had on my podcast even talked about sort of sucking air through his teeth and getting things that he could taste or pick up that way, that's even different from what he can smell and what he can taste. So you can do an awful lot with that. So this is Bernheim's wheat whiskey.
And how is it drunk? Is it in a shot glass? Is it in do you have a large amount?
No. It's usually, this is a larger glass than normal. It was a travel glass that I actually got from another bourbon company, a brand new whiskey company called Gonzo. Gave me a little travel kit and had that glass with it. Usually I'm using what's called a Glencairn. It's a finer one that sort of opens up at the top, so easier for you to pick up the nose as it comes up. You can, one of the things for people who think they don't like whiskey or it's too strong, you don't want to add too much water because you want to taste the whiskey. But the best way to, you actually will taste different things trying it neat versus adding just a couple of drops of water. And so I usually carry one of these around with me, and just adding 2 or 3 drops of water will kind of open it up. And for somebody who finds the burn a little too much, you can add water enough that you kind of smooth out the burn, but you can still taste the flavor of the whiskey. And of course, people have it over ice. People put it in cocktails. People make long drinks out of it, by adding ginger ale or other kinds of, cocktail mixes. The highball is typically a whiskey with ginger ale. But it doesn't have to be ginger. It could be, a splash of soda or something else. As cocktail, making cocktails a whole art form in of its own. But there isn't really a wrong way to have it. You have it in the way that you enjoy it. And sometimes it's about trying things until you find something that works for you. Because when I first came to this country, I did not like bourbon at all. Having grown up with Scotch, bourbon was sweet and it was harsh. And until the first bottle that I tried that changed my mind was something called Evan Williams, made by Heaven Hill. It was the Evan Williams single barrel, and it was so smooth and so delicious. It was like a revelation, like bourbon can taste like this. And that's been the beginning of the discovery, is that, there's so much variety. It's amazing how this brown liquid can taste so many different ways. And so there's always something new. As Ryan will say, when you're looking for this or you're looking for that or you missed out on something, there'll always be more bourbon. There's so much out there to explore.
Well, I am just so fascinated, having grown up with really no alcohol in my life. So it's only about right now 11 o'clock in the morning. So I'm going to sniff. Not bad for 10 o'clock in the morning. My first drink of bourbon.
Okay. Well,
thank you so much for the taste testing. But also, I'm going to be so fascinated when you come back from your next sabbatical, what you've learned in those archives. I can't thank you enough for sharing not only your interest in bourbon and your education in social anthropology and sociology. It's just been fascinating. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful holiday season. I'm sure it's going to be jam-packed with lots and lots of social events and religious events. So I'm really excited for myself and for our viewers that everyone has an opportunity to celebrate, perhaps with a little taste of bourbon.